So, you've heard of the digital detox, right? This idea that if you just unplug from social media, you'll suddenly feel happier. It's everywhere. But here's the big question. Does it actually work? Today, we're going to cut through all the noise and get a real, evidence-based answer. We're breaking down a major scientific review, a meta-analysis actually, that looks at all the data. So, let's get into it.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down, just following the science. We'll have 5 parts. First, we'll talk about the social media dilemma itself, the core problem. Then, we'll look at how scientists actually investigate this stuff. After that, we get to the good part, the core findings. From there, we'll explore why the results are what they are, and we'll finish up with what this all means for you and me.
Okay, so first up, the social media dilemma. This really gets to the core of it, doesn't it? Why does so many of us feel this constant push and pull with social media? And why does the idea of just disconnecting sound so good sometimes?
Well, it all boils down to what researchers call the mobile connectivity paradox. And it's basically 2 competing ideas. On one side, you've got what's called the substance analogy. The thinking here is that taking a break is good for you, right? It cuts down on distraction, FOMO, and that endless social comparison. But on the other side, there are the disconnection drawbacks. The idea that totally unplugging can actually make you feel bored, trigger cravings, or even leave you feeling more isolated. So you've got these 2 totally conflicting hypotheses, which is exactly why we needed a big study to settle the score.
And that leads us right into section 2, how science investigates. Now, to get a really solid answer here, researchers didn't just do another study. No, they used a much more powerful tool. It's called a systematic review and meta-analysis. Basically, it's a way to scoop up all the best studies on a topic, combine the results, and find the real signal in all the noise.
So to make sure they were comparing apples to apples, they use a framework called PICO. It just sets really clear rules for which studies get included. For the population, they looked only at healthy adults. The intervention they studied was complete abstinence, not just cutting back, but stopping entirely. The comparison group was people with normal, unrestricted social media use. And finally, the outcomes they measured were things like positive and negative feelings and overall life satisfaction.
And this right here really shows you how rigorous this whole process is. They used the system called Prisma, and get this, they started with over 5,000 potential studies. Then they went through this intense filtering process, getting rid of duplicates, irrelevant research, or studies that just weren't high quality enough. In the end, they were left with just 10 rock-solid studies that perfectly matched their criteria.
And those 10 studies? They gave the researchers data from a whopping 4,674 people. That is a huge sample size. What that means is that the analysis has a ton of statistical power. In simple terms, we can be much more confident that the results we're about to see are reliable and not just a fluke.
All right, this brings us to section 3, and this is really the moment we've been building up to, the core findings. So, with all that data from nearly 5,000 people, what did the combined evidence actually say? Let's find out.
So the first big thing they looked at was positive affect. Now, that's just a scientific term for feelings like enthusiasm, energy, being alert, the good stuff. The question was, does a social media detox boost these feelings? Okay, now this chart is called a forest plot, but don't worry about all the individual lines. The most important part is that diamond at the bottom. That represents the combined result of all the studies. And what you need to see is that it crosses that vertical line in the middle, the line of no effect. A high p-value confirms what our eyes are telling us. The result is not statistically significant. So the conclusion is crystal clear. Taking a break from social media does not significantly increase your positive emotions.
All right, so if it doesn't boost the good feelings, what about the bad ones? The second thing they measured was negative affect. We're talking about things like anger, guilt, fear, irritability. You'd think that stepping away from social media would have to reduce those, wouldn't you?
Well, the data tells a remarkably consistent story. If you look at this forest plot, that diamond at the bottom, the overall effect, is once again sitting right on that line of no effect. Another high p-value means this result is also clearly non-significant. So the bottom line is, taking a break from social media didn't lead to any meaningful decrease in negative emotions either.
And that brings us to the third and final outcome they measured, overall life satisfaction. This is the big picture one, right? It's not just about how you feel moment to moment, but how you evaluate your life as a whole.
And well, you can probably guess where this is going. The pattern holds. The overall effect for life satisfaction was, again, non-significant. This is a really powerful finding when you put it all together. across all three key measures of well-being: positive emotions, negative emotions, and overall life satisfaction. A short-term, complete detox from social media just didn't have any meaningful impact.
Okay, so this brings up a really obvious question, and you're probably thinking it right now. Most of these studies were about a week long. Maybe that's just not enough time. What if you do a longer detox? Does the duration make a difference?
Great question. And the researchers checked for that specifically, using something called a meta-regression. Basically, they plotted the effect of the detox against how long it lasted. And as you can see from this chart, that trend line is completely flat. The stats back it up. The length of the detox, at least up to 28 days, had zero significant relationship with any of the well-being outcomes. A longer break just didn't seem to help.
So that takes us to section 4. Why was there no significant effect? I mean, if the digital detox is such a popular idea, why does the hard evidence show that it, well, doesn't really work? The paper digs into a few key scientific explanations for this surprising result.
Okay, there are two main ideas here. The first is called the zero net sum effect. The theory is that any good things you get from a detox, like feeling more peaceful, might get canceled out by the bad things, like feeling bored or lonely. So in the end, it's a wash, a net zero change. The second hypothesis is about short-term actions versus long-term feelings. It basically argues that a brief intervention, like a one-week detox, just isn't powerful enough to change a really deep long-term metric, like your overall life satisfaction.
And then there's a huge practical issue. Just sticking with it. It turns out complete abstinence is really, really hard. While some studies had people who complied, others not so much. For instance, one study found that only about 14% of people could actually stay off social media completely for a whole week. And it's probably because, as many studies reported, people experience side effects like loneliness, intense boredom, and cravings. It just shows that for most people, going cold turkey is a real struggle.
So where does that leave us? This brings us to our final and maybe most important section, the implications and conclusion. If the simple digital detox isn't the magic bullet we thought it was, then what is the answer? Where do we go from here? Well, the research points to a much smarter path forward. First, it says we need to ditch what's called the binary fallacy, this all-or-nothing idea that you're either on social media or you're off. That's just not helpful. Second, we need to get more nuanced and personal. What works for one person might not work for another. Your mindset and motivation really matter. And finally, we need to shift our focus to sustainable strategies. Things like setting time limits on apps, or being mindful about which specific behaviors are actually causing problems, instead of just trying to eliminate everything at once.
And all of this leads to the clinical bottom line. If there is one thing you take away from this entire analysis, let it be this. Temporarily and completely abstaining from social media yields no statistically significant improvement in well-being. So for anyone trying to build a healthier relationship with technology, the evidence is clear. We need to move away from the all-or-nothing digital detox. The goal should be mindful, sustainable strategies that target the specific things that aren't working for us. Ultimately, the question isn't whether we should disconnect completely. It's about how we can learn to connect more intentionally.